The radio crackled to life at 3:47 hours, shattering the pre-dawn silence of Naval Air Station Oceana. All available strike aircraft, priority tasking. We have Angels down in hostile territory. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Commander Marcus Hawthorne, operations officer for Strike Fighter Squadron 143, and the tension in his transmission cut through the static like a blade through silk. In the ready room, pilots stirred from their restless half-sleep, the fluorescent lights humming overhead casting harsh shadows across weathered faces. Coffee cups clinked against steel tables, flight suits rustled, and the familiar symphony of preparation began. But something felt different this morning. The urgency in Hawthorne's voice carried an edge that veteran aviators recognized, the kind that meant people were going to die if everything didn't go exactly right. Captain Lydia Razor Volkov sat motionless in the corner, her angular features illuminated by the pale glow of her tablet screen. While others scrambled for details, she remained perfectly still, her ice-blue eyes scanning tactical displays with the methodical precision of a surgeon examining X-rays. The other pilots barely acknowledged her presence. To them, she was the outsider, the transfer from the Air Force who'd somehow landed a slot in their elite Navy squadron despite her unconventional background. What they didn't know was that Razor had been awake for the past 3 hours, studying satellite imagery of the Kanhar province in eastern Afghanistan. She'd felt it in her bones, the way the intelligence reports had been filtering in all week, the subtle changes in mission tempo, the way senior officers had been holding hushed conversations behind closed doors. Something was building, and when it broke, she wanted to be ready. The briefing screen flickered to life, displaying a topographical map marked with red zones and overlapping circles of threat rings. Hawthorne's laser pointer traced a route through the Hindu Kush Mountains, pausing at a valley so narrow it looked like a crack in the Earth's surface. "Gentlemen," he began, his eyes sweeping the room before landing briefly on Razor, "and lady, we have a situation." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the building's ventilation system seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly toward the horizon, but every person in that room knew their thoughts were already 7,000 miles away, in a place where the thin mountain air carried the scent of cordite and death, where American warriors were fighting for their lives against impossible odds, and where the margin for error had just shrunk to nothing. Hawthorne clicked to the next slide, and the room collectively leaned forward. The mission they were about to hear would change everything, not just for the men trapped in that distant valley, but for every aviator in the room, especially the quiet woman in the corner whose call sign carried a story that none of them yet understood. The stakes had never been higher, and time was running out. The satellite image on the screen showed a landscape that seemed designed by a malevolent god, jagged peaks rising like broken teeth from the earth, valleys carved so deep they disappeared into shadow even at midday, and ridgelines that formed natural fortresses for anyone bold enough to claim them. This was the Kanhar province, where empires had come to die for 3,000 years, and where 24 hours earlier, a joint special operations task force had walked into the perfect trap. Operation Vigilant Harvest, Hawthorne continued, his voice steady despite the gravity of what he was about to reveal. 36 hours ago, SEAL Team 6, supported by Rangers from the 75th, conducted a precision raid on a high-value target compound in this valley. His pointer circled a cluster of buildings nestled against the eastern slope of a mountain that local maps couldn't even name. Intelligence indicated the presence of a Taliban commander responsible for coordinating attacks on coalition supply routes. The pilots exchanged glances. HVT raids were routine, the bread and butter of special operations in Afghanistan. But if this had been routine, they wouldn't be sitting in this briefing room at 4 in the morning, watching their operations officers jaw clench with barely contained tension. "The raid was successful," Hawthorne said and paused. "Too successful." Lieutenant Jake Viper Morrison, the squadron's most senior pilot after Hawthorne himself, shifted in his seat. "How do you mean, sir?" They grabbed not just the target but his entire command structure. 12 high-ranking Taliban leaders, plus intelligence materials that are apparently significant enough to make some very important people in Washington lose sleep. Hawthorne clicked to the next slide, showing a tactical overlay with friendly positions marked in blue. The problem is, someone was expecting them. The image shifted to show the valley floor, where the SEAL insertion point was marked with a pulsing blue dot. Around it, like ripples spreading from a stone thrown into still water, were dozens of red triangles, enemy positions that had materialized as if from the earth itself within minutes of the Special Operations Forces touching down. Current situation: 24 SEALs and 8 Rangers are trapped in a compound approximately here. Hawthorne's pointer settled on a spot that looked impossibly small against the vast terrain surrounding it. They're taking effective fire from multiple directions, including heavy weapons positions on the ridgelines. Estimates put enemy strength at over 200 fighters, with more arriving hourly. Razor felt her stomach tight. She'd studied enough after-action reports to know what this meant. The special operations teams were outnumbered nearly 7 to 1, trapped in terrain that offered their enemies every possible advantage. Without immediate and overwhelming air support, the best warriors America had ever produced were going to be overrun and killed, their bodies dragged through the mountains as trophies for the Taliban's propaganda machine. Extraction is not currently possible due to the threat environment, Hawthorne continued. Fixed-wing gunships can't operate effectively in the terrain, and rotary-wing assets are taking too much ground fire to maintain a presence over the target area. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence carried a different weight. Every pilot present understood the mathematics of modern warfare. Without air cover, without the ability to evacuate wounded, without resupply, even the most elite ground forces had a finite lifespan when surrounded by a determined enemy. The next slide showed what everyone had been dreading: the timeline. Hawthorne's voice dropped to a near whisper as he traced the progression of events that had led them to this moment. First contact occurred at 6:30 local time yesterday. By 800, they were effectively surrounded. Since then, they've been fighting a defensive action that has cost them 6 wounded and depleted their ammunition to critical levels. Razor's mind immediately began calculating. If the SEALs and Rangers had been in continuous contact for nearly 24 hours, their situation was beyond desperate. Elite Special Operations Forces carried enough ammunition for perhaps 6 hours of sustained combat under ideal conditions. They'd been fighting 4 times longer than that, in terrain that favored their enemies, against odds that would have broken conventional forces in the first hour. The good news, Hawthorne continued, though his tone suggested he was using the term loosely, is that we've established communication with the team leader, Senior Chief Petty Officer David Granite Kowalski. He's managing to maintain unit cohesion and defensive positions despite the pressure they're under. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Phoenix Kim, the squadron's weapons systems officer, raised her hand. "Sir, what about air assets already in theater? Surely we've got Apache A-10s, something providing close air support." Hawthorne's expression darkened. "We've lost 2 aircraft already. An Apache took an RPG hit and made an emergency landing 40 clicks south. Crew recovered, bird totaled. An Air Force took small arms fire that damaged its hydraulics. Pilot made it back to Bagram, but the aircraft is out of commission for at least 72 hours. The implications hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. The enemy wasn't just numerous and well-positioned. They were equipped with weapons systems capable of engaging modern military aircraft. This wasn't a ragtag collection of insurgents with AK-47s. This was a well-coordinated force that had prepared for exactly this scenario. "Which brings us to why you're all here," Hawthorne said, his gaze sweeping across the assembled pilots. "We need to get strike aircraft over that valley, and we need to do it in a way that neutralizes the ground-based air defense threat without compromising the safety of our people on the ground. Morrison leaned forward. What's the plan, sir? Multi-pronged approach. First wave will be electronic warfare, jam their communications, blind their targeting systems. Second wave will be SEAD, suppression of enemy air defenses, take out anything that can reach our aircraft. Third wave will be close air support, danger close fire missions to break the siege. It sounded simple when laid out like that, but every pilot in the room knew the reality would be infinitely more complex. The terrain alone made it a nightmare. Mountains that rose above service ceilings, valleys so narrow that a single miscalculation would turn an FA-18 Super Hornet into a smoking crater, and wind patterns that could change faster than human reflexes could compensate. And threading through all of that complexity was the most dangerous variable of all: the knowledge that somewhere in that valley, American warriors were counting the minutes until their ammunition ran out, watching the sky for salvation that might never come. Hawthorne clicked to a detailed tactical map that showed the valley from multiple angles, satellite imagery, topographical surveys, and intercepts from surveillance drones that had managed brief overflights before being driven off by surface-to-air missiles. The compound where the Special Operations Forces were trapped sat like an island in a sea of hostile territory, its defensive perimeter marked by the red tracers that had been photographed streaking through the pre-dawn darkness. The challenge, Hawthorne explained, is that the valley is effectively a natural SAM site. The ridgelines provide perfect positioning for shoulder-fired missiles, and intelligence suggests they've got at least 2 vehicle-mounted systems that can engage targets at altitude. His pointer traced the high ground surrounding the compound. Any conventional approach is going to put our aircraft in a kill box with multiple overlapping fields of fire. Razor studied the imagery with the intensity of a chess master, examining a position 3 moves from checkmate. She'd flown missions over similar terrain during her time with the Air Force, supporting special operations in the mountainous regions of northern Iraq. The key wasn't avoiding the threat. In terrain like this, that was impossible. The key was managing it, using speed and surprise to minimize exposure while maximizing effect on target. "Sir," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the low murmur of side conversations that had started among the other pilots, "what's the weather forecast for the target area?" Hawthorne paused, consulting his notes. "Current conditions are clear skies, visibility unlimited, winds variable at 15 to 25 knots with gusts to 40. Mountain wave activity is significant above 8,000 feet." Razor nodded, her mind processing the information with mechanical precision. Mountain wave turbulence was a pilot killer in terrain like this, but it could also be an asset if used correctly. Aircraft riding the wave could achieve phenomenal rates of climb and descent, allowing for approach profiles that conventional tactics wouldn't consider. "What about cloud cover projections?" she pressed. "Forecast calls for scattered cumulus building to overcast by 1200 local, with mountain obscuration possible by mid-afternoon." "Razor," Morrison interjected with barely concealed irritation, "what's your point? We're talking about a time-critical mission here, not a meteorology lesson." She turned to face him, her expression neutral but her eyes carrying an intensity that made several pilots shift uncomfortably. "My point is that we have a window. If we're going to do this, we need to do it in the next 6 hours, before the weather deteriorates and traps us in instrument conditions over mountains that will kill us faster than any surface-to-air missile." Hawthorne studied her for a long moment. "You have something in mind?" "Yes, sir, I do." Razor stood and moved to the tactical display, her finger tracing a route that seemed to defy common sense. "But it's going to require precision flying that pushes every aircraft and pilot to the absolute limit of their capabilities." The room fell silent as the implications of her words sank in. What she was suggesting wasn't just dangerous. It was the kind of mission that would either be studied in military academies for decades as a masterpiece of tactical aviation, or remembered as the day an entire squadron disappeared into the mountains of Afghanistan, leaving nothing behind but wreckage and unanswered questions. Razor's finger traced a path across the tactical display that made several pilots unconsciously hold their breath. Instead of the conventional approach, flying high above the valley and diving down to attack, she was proposing something that violated every principle of safe mountain flying. Her route showed aircraft approaching from the west, using a series of connecting valleys to remain below the radar horizon until the last possible moment. "The enemy expects us to come from the east," she explained, her voice steady and professional. "That's where our bases are, that's where previous air support has originated from, and that's where they've positioned their heaviest air defense assets." Her finger moved to show the concentration of threat rings on the eastern approaches. "But if we approach from the west, using terrain masking to stay invisible until we're directly over the target area, we can achieve tactical surprise." Morrison shook his head. "That approach takes us through 3 separate valley systems, each one narrow enough to be a death trap if we encounter any kind of mechanical problem or adverse weather. And the final run," he paused, studying the map more closely. "Jesus, Razor, you're talking about flying through a gap that's barely wide enough for one aircraft at a time, at speeds that don't allow for error correction." "I'm talking about flying through a gap that's wide enough for one aircraft at a time," she corrected. "Which means we go in single file, with precise timing, and we trust each other to maintain formation discipline under conditions where a single mistake kills everyone behind you." The silence that followed was profound. What Razor was proposing wasn't just tactically sound, it was brilliant. By approaching from an unexpected direction and using the terrain to mask their approach, they could achieve the kind of surprise that would allow them to neutralize the air defense threat before the enemy could react. But the execution would require flying skills that pushed the boundaries of what was humanly possible. "How do you thread the needle on that final approach?" asked Lieutenant Angela Ghost Martinez, the squadron's youngest pilot but also one of its most technically proficient. "The satellite imagery shows that gap is maybe 200 meters wide, with updrafts and downdrafts that could slam an aircraft into the canyon wall without warning." Razor's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes suggested she'd been waiting for exactly that question. "You don't thread the needle," she said quietly. "You become the needle." She moved to a different section of the display, calling up a 3-dimensional representation of the final approach. "The key is understanding that in terrain like this, the aircraft isn't flying through the environment, it's part of the environment. You read the air currents, you feel the mountain waves, you use the updrafts to gain altitude and the downdrafts to lose it, all while maintaining precise airspeed and altitude control." Hawthorne studied the proposed route with the expression of a man trying to decide whether he was looking at genius or madness. "Razor, what you're describing requires a level of terrain-following capability that most pilots don't possess. Hell, that most pilots have never even attempted to develop." "Yes, sir, it does." She turned to face the assembled aviators, her gaze steady and unflinching. "Which is why I'm recommending a modified mission profile. Instead of sending the entire squadron, we send a 2-ship formation. Lead aircraft handles navigation and target acquisition. Wingman provides backup and watches for threats. Small formation, maximum surprise, surgical precision." The implications of what she was suggesting hit the room like a physical blow. She wasn't just proposing to lead this mission. She was proposing to do it with minimal backup, maximum personal risk, and stakes that couldn't be higher. Morrison's voice carried an edge of disbelief when he spoke. "You're talking about a 2-ship formation, flying NOE through some of the most dangerous terrain on Earth, to engage an enemy force that's already proven capable of shooting down our aircraft, in support of a ground element that's hours away from being overrun." He paused, shaking his head. "It's suicide." "No," Razor replied calmly. It's the only option that gives those SEALs and Rangers a fighting chance." The weight of her words settled over the briefing room like a shroud. Everyone present understood the mathematics of the situation. Conventional approaches had already failed, time was running out, and the margin for error had shrunk to nothing. What Razor was proposing might be incredibly dangerous, but doing nothing was a death sentence for 32 of America's finest warriors. Hawthorne consulted his tablet, then looked up with the expression of a man who just made a decision that would either save lives or destroy careers. "Razor, you've got tactical command of this mission. Choose your wingman and brief your approach profile. Launch time is 6:30. That gives you 90 minutes to prepare." The selection of a wingman was crucial. Razor needed someone with the technical skills to fly formation in impossible conditions, the tactical awareness to adapt when the plan inevitably went sideways, and the trust to follow her through terrain that would challenge the world's best aviators. Her gaze swept across the assembled pilots, weighing options that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. "Ghost," she said finally, looking directly at Lieutenant Martinez, "you're with me." Martinez blinked in surprise. She was skilled, certainly, but she was also the most junior pilot in the squadron, with barely 2 years of tactical flying experience. Several more senior aviators shifted uncomfortably, clearly expecting to be chosen for what was shaping up to be one of the most challenging missions any of them had ever heard of. "Razor," Morrison interjected, "with all due respect, don't you think this mission calls for more experienced?" "Ghost has 800 hours in mountain terrain," Razor cut him off, her voice still calm but carrying an undertone of finality. "She's the only pilot in this squadron who's actually flown NOE through terrain comparable to what we're going to encounter. Experience matters, but specific experience matters more." Martinez swallowed hard, the weight of what she'd just been asked to do settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. "Yes, ma'am. I'm honored by your confidence." "Don't be honored yet," Razor replied with the ghost of a smile. "Wait until we're on the ground in one piece with mission accomplished. Then you can be honored." Hawthorne stood, signaling the end of the briefing. "Gentlemen, ladies, we've got American warriors counting on us. Let's not let them down." He paused, his gaze settling on Razor and Martinez. "Bring them home." As the other pilots filed out of the briefing room, heading for their preparations, Razor remained behind, staring at the tactical display with an intensity that suggested she was memorizing every pixel. The mission ahead would test everything she'd learned in 15 years of military flying, but it would also test something deeper, the part of her that had earned the call sign Razor, not through luck or politics, but through a demonstrated ability to cut through impossibly complex situations with surgical precision. The clock on the wall showed 4:45. In less than 2 hours, she would find out if that reputation was deserved. The pre-flight preparation took place in a hangar that hummed with the quiet efficiency of professionals under pressure. Maintenance crews swarmed over 2 FA-18F Super Hornets, checking every system with the meticulous attention to detail that separated elite naval aviation from everyone else. These weren't just aircraft. They were precision instruments worth $60 million each, capable of carrying 12,000 pounds of ordnance at speeds approaching Mach 2, equipped with radar systems that could track hundreds of targets simultaneously, and weapons that could strike with accuracy measured in inches rather than yards. Razor walked her pre-flight inspection with the methodical pace of a surgeon scrubbing for a particularly complex operation. Every rivet, every panel, every external component received her complete attention. The aircraft assigned to her, side number 103, call sign Reaper 1, was one of the squadron's newest jets, with less than 400 flight hours on the airframe and engines that had been overhauled just 3 weeks earlier. "How's she looking, Chief?" Razor asked the plane captain, Senior Chief Petty Officer Maria Santos, whose weathered hands could diagnose mechanical problems by touch, and whose experience with FA-18s stretched back to the original Hornet variants of the 1980s. "Clean bird, Captain," Santos replied, wiping her hands on a rag that had seen better decades. "Engines are running sweet, all weapon systems check good, and I personally inspected every piece of ordnance that's going on her." She paused, studying Razor's face with the frank assessment of someone who'd watched too many pilots head into combat over the years. "You sure about this loadout?" Razor nodded, consulting the ordnance sheet on her kneeboard. Instead of the mixed bag of air-to-air and air-to-ground weapons that most multi-role fighters carried, her aircraft was configured specifically for the mission ahead. 4 GBU-38 Joint Direct Attack munitions for precision strikes, 2 AGM-88 HARM missiles for suppression of enemy air defenses, and a single AIM-120 AMRAAM for self-defense against the remote possibility of enemy aircraft. "The mission profile doesn't allow for multiple attack runs," she explained. "We're going to get one pass through that valley, maybe two if we're lucky. Every weapon has to count." 30 yards away, Martinez was conducting her own pre-flight inspection of Reaper 2, with the nervous energy of someone who'd just been handed the opportunity of a lifetime and wasn't entirely sure she was qualified for it. Her aircraft carried an identical weapons load, configured as a backup in case Razor's jet suffered mechanical problems or combat damage. The hangar's public address system crackled to life. "Reaper Flight, you have a priority message waiting in mission planning." Razor and Martinez exchanged glances. Priority messages during pre-flight usually meant one of two things: mission cancellation or significant changes to the tactical situation. Given the time-critical nature of their tasking, neither option was particularly appealing. They found Hawthorne waiting for them in mission planning, his expression grave as he held a secure phone handset that was still warm from extended use. "I just got off the phone with the Joint Operations Center," he said without preamble. "The situation on the ground has deteriorated." Razor felt her stomach clench. If the SEALs and Rangers were in even worse condition than they'd been an hour ago, the window for effective air support might have already closed. "How bad?" Martinez asked, her voice carefully controlled. "Senior Chief Kowalski reports they're down to less than 30 minutes of ammunition for sustained defensive fire. Enemy forces have moved anti-aircraft assets to within 800 meters of the compound perimeter." Hawthorne paused, letting the implication sink in. "The good news is that gives us precise coordinates for the air defense threat. The bad news is that those coordinates put enemy weapon systems close enough to engage us during our attack runs." Razor studied the updated intelligence package with the detached analytical focus that had served her well in dozens of combat missions. The tactical picture was becoming clearer, and it wasn't encouraging. The enemy wasn't just trying to overrun the Special Operations Forces. They were using them as bait, hopping to draw American aircraft into a carefully prepared kill zone. "Sir," she said quietly, "I need to modify our approach profile." The modification Razor proposed was so audacious it bordered on the insane. Instead of attacking the air defense sites first, and then providing close air support to the trapped ground forces, she wanted to reverse the sequence. Hit the enemy infantry positions first, using the confusion and casualties to disrupt their anti-aircraft coverage. Then engage the air defense sites while their crews were distracted by the chaos around them. "You're talking about flying directly over active SAM sites to attack secondary targets," Hawthorne said, his voice carrying the tone of someone trying to talk a friend down from a very tall ledge. "That's not tactical innovation. That's a violation of every principle of self-preservation we teach." "Yes, sir, it is," Razor agreed. "But it's also the only approach that gives us any chance of success. The enemy expects us to follow doctrine, suppress air defenses first, then attack ground targets. They've positioned their assets accordingly. If we do the unexpected, we gain precious seconds of tactical surprise that could make the difference between mission success and failure." Martinez studied the revised flight plan with growing alarm. What Razor was proposing would require them to fly directly through the engagement envelope of multiple surface-to-air missile systems, maintaining precise formation while delivering ordnance danger close to American forces, all while flying at altitudes and speeds that left no margin for error. "Captain," she said carefully, "I'm not questioning the tactical logic, but the execution risks are enormous. If we take battle damage on the first pass, we might not be able to egress the target area safely." "If we don't take those risks," Razor replied, 32 Americans are going to die in the next hour." She turned to face both Martinez and Hawthorne, her expression carrying an intensity that made both officers unconsciously straighten. "I've studied the after-action reports from every failed close air support mission of the last decade. Do you know what the common factor is? Pilots who were more concerned with following doctrine than with saving lives." The silence that followed was loaded with implications. What Razor was saying challenged fundamental assumptions about risk management in military aviation, the careful balance between accomplishing the mission and bringing aircrew home safely. But she was also right about the stakes. Somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, American warriors were fighting for their lives with weapons and ammunition that were measured in minutes rather than hours. Hawthorne consulted his watch, then made the decision that would either validate Razor's reputation or end her career. "You have authorization for modified approach profile. Mission launch remains scheduled for 6:30. That gives you 15 minutes to complete your brief and get airborne." As they headed for their aircraft, Martinez caught Razor's arm. "Captain, can I ask you something?" "Shoot." "Why did you really pick me for this mission? There are pilots in this squadron with twice my experience and 3 times my flight hours." Razor paused at the base of the ladder leading up to her cockpit, considering the question with the gravity it deserved. Because experience and flight hours don't mean anything if they teach you to be cautious when the situation calls for audacity. She looked directly at Martinez, her blue eyes reflecting the harsh fluorescent lighting of the hangar. "I need someone who trusts their training, trusts their aircraft, and trusts me enough to follow where I lead even when every instinct says it's impossible." Martinez swallowed hard, then nodded. "Yes, ma'am, I won't let you down." "I know you won't," Razor replied, beginning her climb into the cockpit. "Because if you do, we're all going to be very dead very quickly." The engines of both Super Hornets began their characteristic whine as the pilots strapped in and began their startup procedures. In less than 10 minutes, they would be airborne and committed to a mission that would either save 32 lives or add 2 more names to the casualty lists that had grown too long over 20 years of war in Afghanistan. The twin General Electric F414 engines spooled up with a sound like controlled thunder, their exhaust creating heat mirages that danced across the pre-dawn tarmac. Razor's hands moved through the startup checklist with practiced efficiency, each switch and control positioned with the muscle memory of someone who'd performed this ritual thousands of times. But beneath the familiar routine, her mind was already in the cockpit of an aircraft screaming through mountain valleys at 500 knots, threading a needle measured in meters, while enemy gunners tracked her with weapons designed to turn aircraft into falling stars. "Reaper Flight Ground Control, you're cleared to taxi." "Ground Reaper 1, taxi to ship." The Super Hornets rolled out of the hangar into a Virginia morning that promised perfect flying weather, clear skies, unlimited visibility, and winds that barely registered on the aircraft's sophisticated sensors. It was the kind of morning that made flying seem like poetry rather than physics, where the boundary between man and machine dissolved into something approaching grace. But their destination lay 7,000 miles away, where the weather was irrelevant and grace was measured in thousandths of seconds that separated successful weapons delivery from catastrophic failure. Tower Reaper 1, Flight of 2, ready for departure. Reaper 1, Tower, wind calm, cleared for takeoff, runway 09. The acceleration down the runway pressed Razor back into her ejection seat with the familiar embrace of raw power barely contained by human engineering. At 140 knots, she pulled back on the stick and felt the aircraft leap away from the earth with the eagerness of something that had never truly belonged to the ground. Martinez followed in perfect formation, her aircraft rising like a shadow of Razor's jet, two machines and two pilots becoming a single entity, dedicated to a mission that would test everything they'd learned about flying, fighting, and surviving. Departure, Reaper Flight airborne, requesting vectors to the tanker. Reaper Flight, departure control, turn left heading 045, climb and maintain flight level 250. Contact Giant 57 on frequency 264.4 for refueling. The Atlantic Ocean spread beneath them like hammered steel, its surface broken by the wakes of ships that looked like toys from 30,000 feet. But Razor's attention was already focused beyond the immediate tactical requirements of formation flying and navigation. In her mind, she was rehearsing the approach profile that would take them through valleys, where a single miscalculation would scatter wreckage across mountainsides that had already claimed too many aircraft and too many lives. Giant 57, Reaper Flight, two Super Hornets requesting fuel. Reaper Flight Giant 57, cleared to the basket, take what you need. The aerial refueling evolution proceeded with mechanical precision. Two needle-sharp aircraft mating with a flying gas station at 300 miles per hour, transferring thousands of pounds of fuel through a connection that required piloting skills measured in fractions of inches. But even as Razor concentrated on maintaining position behind the tanker's drogue, part of her mind was calculating fuel requirements for a mission profile that would push both aircraft to the limits of their range and endurance. Reaper Flight, you're topped off, cleared to disconnect. Contact approach on 254.75, good hunting. Giant 57, Reaper Flight, thanks for the gas. As they banked away from the tanker and began their transit to the combat theater, Razor checked her navigation display and felt the familiar tightening in her chest that preceded every combat mission. In 6 hours, they would be over Afghanistan. In 7 hours, they would find out if her tactical innovation was brilliant strategy or elaborate suicide. The sun climbed toward its zenith as two Super Hornets streaked eastward, carrying weapons and hope toward a valley where Americans were dying while waiting for salvation that might never arrive. The flight across the Atlantic passed in the compressed time that characterized long-range military aviation. Hours of routine procedures punctuated by moments of intense concentration as they navigated through increasingly complex airspace. Over the Mediterranean, they refueled again from a KC-135 that had launched from Sigonella, the ancient Stratotanker's engines leaving contrails that dissipated in the thin air like prayers written in vapor. Reaper Flight Rome Center, contact Kabul approach on frequency 326.1, good luck out there. Rome Center, Reaper Flight switching. The transition from European to Afghan airspace was marked by a subtle but unmistakable change in radio traffic. The precise, clipped communications of NATO air traffic control gave way to the more urgent, operationally focused transmissions of a combat theater. Every frequency carried reports of troops in contact, close air support requests, and medical evacuations that painted an audio portrait of a war that had been grinding on for 2 decades without resolution. Kabul approach, Reaper Flight, 2 Super Hornets, squawking 4257, requesting vectors to working area. Reaper Flight, Kabul approach, squawk 4262, turn right heading 090, descend and maintain 15,000, contact Overlord on frequency 248.3. Below them, Afghanistan spread like a topographical map come to life, endless mountains carved by valleys that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, where Alexander's armies had marched and died, where British regiments had disappeared without trace, where Soviet helicopters had burned on rocky slopes that remembered nothing and forgave less. It was beautiful and terrible in equal measure, a landscape that seemed designed to humble human ambition. Overlord Reaper Flight checking in, 2 Super Hornets with full ordnance, ready for tasking. Reaper Flight, Overlord, we've been expecting you. Current situation is critical. Ground Element is requesting immediate close air support, danger close, multiple enemy positions. Be advised, previous air assets have taken effective fire from surface-to-air threats in the target area. Razor felt her pulse quicken. After 7 hours of flying, they were finally approaching the moment when all their planning and preparation would be tested against the unforgiving reality of combat. Overlord, Reaper 1, requesting handoff to ground controller. Reaper 1, contact Granite on frequency 251.0. Good hunting. Granite was Senior Chief Petty Officer David Kowalski, the SEAL team leader who'd been fighting for his life and the lives of his men for more than 30 hours. His voice, when it came through Razor's headset, carried the hoarse exhaustion of someone who'd been awake for 2 days straight, punctuated by the distant crack of rifle fire and the occasional thump of explosions. Reaper Flight, Granite, Jesus, it's good to hear your voices. We are in serious trouble down here. Granite, Reaper 1, we're inbound your position, requesting tactical update. Reaper 1, we've got approximately 200 enemy fighters in fortified positions on the ridgelines surrounding our compound. They've been pounding us with small arms, RPGs, and what sounds like at least 2 crew-served weapons. We've